Chapter 6 Traders. That evening, Don Diego arrived at his father's house. "How are you, son?" asked Don Alejandro. "Tired, father. My journey from town was long." Then Don Diego spoke of Zorro's visit to the Pulido's country house, and of Sergeant Gonzalez looking for the outlaw at Fray Felipe's house. Then he went on to tell his father of how they whipped Fray Felipe. What cowards! To do this to a priest. But why are you here? "I've decided to marry Señorita Lolita Pulido." "Fine, she's from a good family. But she's refused me because I didn't court her." "Right. So she won't marry you?" "Don Carlos still hopes so." "Then court her. Listen. If you don't marry in 3 months' time, I'll leave all my money to the church when I die." "But father, I mean it. Why can't you be more like Zorro? He has some life in him at least." Just then, they heard horses outside and a knock at the door. A servant opened it, and 10 young gentlemen walked in with swords and guns at their sides. "Don Alejandro, we need food and drink," one of the gentlemen explained. "We are riding after Zorro." Then he spoke of the outlaw's visit to the town square and what followed. "Have you seen the criminal here?" he finished. "No," said Don Alejandro. "Don Diego, did you see him on the highway?" "I'm thankful that I didn't," answered the younger Vega. Then Don Alejandro called for food and wine, and the young gentlemen sat down at the table. Before they started, they put down their swords and guns, and servants moved these to a far corner. Don Alejandro didn't want any trouble. Soon after this, Don Diego stood up. "Señores," he said, "I'm going to bed. Excuse me." "Come back when you've rested," said one of his friends. Don Diego went to his room and locked the door. What's the matter with him? Don Alejandro thought. He sat with his son's friends who were now drinking and singing loudly. "I'd really like Señor Zorro to walk in here now," cried one of them. "Then we could show him a thing or two." "Señores," came a voice from just inside the front door. Zorro stood there in his cloak and mask, a gun in his hand. "Give me my sword. I'll stand and fight him," cried one of the young men sitting at the table. "After all that wine you won't stand very well," laughed Zorro. "Then I'll fight you," said Don Alejandro, getting up angrily. "I agree with most of what you've done, but you mustn't talk to my guests like that." "I spoke truly, Don Alejandro," answered Zorro, "and I refuse to fight you." "Then I'll make you," cried the old man, moving nearer. "Señores," said the outlaw, turning to the young men again, "will you leave this old gentleman to fight in your place?" "No," one of them cried. And with that, 2 of his friends pulled Don Alejandro back to his seat at the table. "Look at you," went on Zorro, "eating, drinking, and forgetting the troubles of those who are poorer and weaker than you. Take your swords in your hands and fight for justice. You're all from good families. You must fight against those who steal in the king's name." "Traitor!" cried one young man, jumping up. "Sit down, or I'll shoot," went on Zorro. "Look, I came here to show you how to live better lives. If a group of the best families in the country come together to fight for what's right, the governor will have to agree to change. Here's an adventure. Don't turn your backs on it. Fight against everything that's wrong and you'll be famous. Or are you afraid?" "Us? Never," cried many voices. "Will you lead us?" asked one young man. "Yes," answered Zorro. "But are you a gentleman?" asked another. "We know neither your face nor your true name." My family's as good as anyone's here, Zorro answered. But for now, my face and name must stay secret. Wait, does Don Alejandro agree with this? We're his guests after all, said another young man. I'm fully behind you, cried Don Alejandro with fire in his voice. All the young men cheered. With the Vegas on their side, even the governor would not fight against them. What shall we do now? One of them asked the outlaw. Go back to Reina de Los Angeles tomorrow morning. Say that you didn't catch Señor Zorro. Find other young men who think like you, and be ready to fight for justice. I'll send you word when the time comes. Do you agree? We do. Good. And now I must go. Don't try to follow me. With that, Zorro went quickly out into the dark night, and they heard his horse galloping away. Then the young men drank to Zorro, Justice, and the Vegas. Don Alejandro felt terrible because his only son was asleep through all of this. Just then, Don Diego's door opened, and he came out sleepily. Why was everybody cheering? He asked. I couldn't rest with all that noise. Señor Zorro was here, explained Don Alejandro. We have lots to tell you. Next morning, the young men rode back into town with Don Diego. Why did father send me with them? He said to himself. I don't like adventures. In the square, they met the other young gentlemen who went after Zorro the night before. Some spoke of seeing the outlaw, and the young gentleman with Don Diego smiled at this. Then Don Diego went to his house. A little later, in his finest suit and carrying a guitar, he traveled by carriage to visit Señorita Lolita at her father's house. She sat with him on the veranda, and he told her how they whipped Fray Felipe the day before, and how Zorro whipped the magistrate. She began to like Don Diego better, but then he said, My father will give his money to the church if I don't marry soon. Do you want this to happen? No, but many women would like to marry you, surely. What about you? She answered softly. You're a gentleman, senor, so I'll tell you my secret. I refuse to marry a man that I cannot love. So you love another, said Don Diego. Yes, I do, answered Señorita Lolita. But if I stop courting you now, your father will be angry. So I'll go on for a while. It'll stop me going on any more adventures. Lolita laughed at these words. Her mother and father heard this and felt hopeful. Then Don Diego began playing the guitar and singing, badly, to their daughter. The messenger carrying Captain Ramon's letter had a surprise when he arrived in Santa Barbara. The governor's fine carriage stood outside the fort there. His Excellency was visiting the town, rewarding his friends, and punishing his enemies. The soldier took Ramon's letter to him at once. The governor read it interestedly. There's trouble in Reina de Los Angeles, he told the captain of the Santa Barbara fort. I must travel there early tomorrow to stop it. The next morning, the same day that Don Diego went courting, the governor and his men arrived in Reina de Los Angeles. He went to the fort and listened to what Captain Ramon could tell him about the Pulidos. These traitors must go to prison as an example to others, said the governor. His soldiers left for the Pulidos' house at the same time that Don Diego arrived back in town in his carriage. Don Carlos's face went white when the soldiers told him, Don Carlos Pulido, you're a traitor. You must go to prison at once on the governor's orders. But when he learned that Donna Catalina and Lolita had to go with him, he became very angry. You can't put my wife and daughter with all the town criminals, he cried. But the soldiers did not listen. Why did you refuse Don Diego, daughter? Said Don Carlos after the prison door closed behind them. Without him as your husband, there's no hope for us. "Don't worry, father," said Lolita. "I'm sure that a friend will punish those who have put us here." She saw in her heart a man in a black mask and cloak coming to help them. Chapter 7. Escape. An hour after they put the Pulidos in prison, Don Diego visited the governor up at the fort. "I'm happy to see you," said His Excellency. "In times of trouble, it's important to know who your friends are." "I'm sorry that I couldn't come sooner, but I was away from home when you arrived. How long will you stay?" "I'll wait for them to bring Zorro to me, dead or alive. Captain Ramon has ordered Sergeant Gonzalez to return, and I have 20 soldiers here too. We'll catch the curse of Capistrano this time, I'm sure." "Let's hope that all ends well," said Don Diego. "These are difficult times," said the governor. "Only today I had to order the arrest of a gentleman, his wife and daughter. But the country must be safe from the king's enemies." "You mean the Pulido family?" "I do. Can I speak to you about that? I'm courting Don Carlos's daughter, you see." "But you're not engaged to her? Because I've learned that the Pulidos are helping Zorro. You wouldn't like to marry into a family of traitors. But to put a gentleman's family in prison with common criminals, Señor, other gentlemen won't think it right. But if I put them under arrest at home, this outlaw Zorro will rescue them. Prison's the only answer." "I see," said Don Diego. "You're no friend of the king's enemies, I hope." "I'm against all the king's real enemies." "I'm happy to hear it," said the governor. After Don Diego left, the governor told Captain Ramon, "You once thought that Don Diego was perhaps a traitor too, but I tell you that he's too weak, too stupid, and too cowardly for that." They both laughed. On his way home, Don Diego met a friend in the town square. "Has our leader sent word to you?" asked the young gentleman quietly in Don Diego's ear. "No, why?" "The Pulidos are in prison. We think that Señor Zorro will try to rescue them." "I hope not," said Don Diego. "I'm starting to feel ill just thinking of it. I must go home to bed." "I hope that you are better soon," laughed his friend. Later that day, a native spoke to the same young man. "A gentleman asks you and your friends to meet him at midnight behind the hill near the San Gabriel Road. He told me to say that a fox is in the neighborhood." The young man smiled. Zorro was Spanish for fox. He went to tell his friends. Just before 12 that night, a group of young gentlemen from the town rode out to meet their leader. They all wore masks and had guns and swords at their sides. "Are you all here?" asked Zorro when they arrived. 29 of us are," came by the answer. Don Diego's ill in bed and seeing nobody. They all laughed. "Right. Now you know why I've called you here. We must rescue the Pulido family from prison. Here's my plan." The young men listened carefully. Soon after that, Zorro and his followers rode to the prison and knocked on the door. "Who's there?" came the guard's voice from inside. "Zorro, open the door now and don't call for help, or you die." The door opened and Zorro and the others hurried in. They quickly unlocked the door to the prison cell. The Pulidos were sitting together inside, far from the common prisoners. "Señor Zorro," cried Don Carlos, "what are you doing here? I've come to rescue you. Let's go." "I'm staying," answered the old man. "I'm ready to take what comes to me. They say that I gave you a place to hide. What will they say if you help me to escape?" "Señor, this is no place for you or your family to stay the night." "Gentlemen," he called. At once, 2 of his followers took Don Carlos from the cell. 2 others took Donna Catalina with them, and Zorro himself held Lolita's hand and led her from the place. "You'll be safe with me," he said. I know, she replied. But while they were leaving the building, 2 of Captain Ramon's men arrived, bringing a thief to the prison. They knew from the masks on the faces of Zorro's followers that something was wrong, and they began shooting. Sergeant Gonzalez and others hurried from the tavern at the noise. Just then, the prison guard shouted, "Zorro's rescuing the Politos!" "Quick, to the prison!" cried Gonzalez. "There's a reward for the man who catches Zorro." The soldiers at the fort heard the noise too, and hurried down to the town at once. By then, Zorro was on his horse with Señorita Lolita sitting in front of him. Don Carlos was on another horse, still shouting that he didn't want rescuing, and Donna Catalina was on a third horse with one of Zorro's followers behind her. She fainted into this young man's arms. The rescuers quickly crossed the town square and rode to the highway. There they divided into 3, following Zorro's plan. Some took Donna Catalina to the Pulido's country house. Others took Don Carlos along the road to Pala to hide the old man in the hut of a friendly native there. Zorro rode with Lolita to Fray Felipe's house where she would be safe. The outlaw smiled while he galloped with Lolita in his arms along the San Gabriel road. At least the soldiers following us must divide into 3, he thought. After a long, hard ride, Zorro's horse arrived at Fray Felipe's house. The outlaw jumped to the ground and helped the young señorita down. He knocked loudly on the priest's door, and when it opened, he took Lolita inside. A minute later, Fray Felipe was saying goodbye to the outlaw on the veranda. "I'll send word soon," said Zorro. "Good," said the priest. He went in and locked the door. Zorro hurried across to his horse. Just then, a group of soldiers rode over the hill. They saw the outlaw in the silver light of the moon. "There he is, men!" cried Sergeant Gonzalez. "After him! The governor will punish us if we don't take him now." Zorro jumped on his horse's back and rode away. He heard soldiers' horses following him and the men's angry cries. But with only one rider to carry now, his horse moved faster than before, and he started to leave these noises behind, when the moon went behind a cloud. Zorro left the highway and rode in the dark to a native's hut just by the road. "They're after me," he called to the native, who quickly took both the outlaw and his horse inside his hut. Zorro hid there silently while the soldiers galloped nearer along the highway. "At least Señorita Lolita's safe," he said to himself. Back at Fray Felipe's house, Sergeant Gonzalez and the other half of his men got off their horses and walked to the house. The sergeant knocked at the door. "What do you want?" asked the priest when he opened it. "We're looking for something that Señor Zorro left behind," said Gonzalez, pushing past. "His horse was slower than usual. He brought a young woman here for you to hide, didn't he?" "I don't know what you mean," the priest answered, smiling. Gonzalez knew that Lolita was there somewhere. He sent his men to look in the different rooms of the house and the buildings around it, but he himself stayed with Fray Felipe. Suddenly, he looked at a tall pile of animal skins in the corner of the room. "What's behind that?" he said. Señorita Lolita came out from behind the skins with a long skinner's knife in her hand. "I'm leaving. Don't try to stop me," she said. "If you do, I'll kill myself. The governor won't like that." True, thought Gonzalez. There'll be trouble if she kills herself while I'm arresting her. "Don't do anything stupid," he cried. "I refuse to go back to a common prisoner's cell, Señor. Better for a Pulido to die than to agree to that. So if you don't want me dead, you'll wait while I take your horse and go." With that she ran, knife in hand, from the room, hurried from the house, jumped on the sergeant's horse, and rode off into the night. "After her," shouted Gonzales from the veranda. Chapter 8. Behind the mask. After the soldiers rode past, Zorro left the native's hut. Then he jumped on his horse and rode to the fort in Reina de Los Angeles. All the soldiers were away looking for him. Only Captain Ramon sat in his office waiting for news. "You!" cried Ramon when the outlaw walked into his office, gun in hand. "Stand with your hands behind your back," came the reply. Zorro tied the captain's hands together. "Where's the governor?" he asked. "At Don Juan Estado's house," answered Ramon. "Then we'll visit him. And remember, my gun's at your head, so no noise." Outside the fort, Zorro told the captain to get on his horse. Then he himself got up behind, and they rode quietly over to Don Juan's house. They went in through the back, and Zorro pushed the captain into the front room, following quickly. His Excellency and Don Juan were at a table talking. "Don't move," said the outlaw. "Zorro," cried the governor, "why are you here?" "To explain," Zorro said. "Excellency, today you wrongly put a gentleman's family in a common prison cell. But they're traitors who've helped you. An outlaw," came the governor's angry reply. "Who told you that?" "Captain Ramon, you had dinner at the Pulido's country house. A native brought the news to the captain, who went after you. Don Carlos hid you in a closet, and when you came out, you wounded Ramon from behind with your sword and escaped." "Captain, now tell the governor the true story. Don Carlos himself sent the native to the fort. The Pulidos didn't know that I was in the closet, and I gave you time to take out your sword and fight like a man. Didn't I? Answer." "Yes, you're right," said the captain. "Is there anything more against the Pulidos, Excellency?" "Yes. While Don Diego Vega was away and the Pulidos were slaying at his house, the captain visited one night and found you there with the señorita. You're the Pulidos' friend, and they hid and helped you, even in the house of someone who's loyal to me. That night you escaped because the señorita stopped the captain catching you." "Now for the true story," said Zorro. "Captain Ramon, you're in love with Señorita Lolita. You found her alone that night and tried to kiss her. She called for help, and I came and kicked you out of the house, didn't I? Speak." "Yes, that's right." "Captain Ramon, you've lied to me," said the governor. "You're no longer an officer." Then he told the outlaw, "But I'm still sure that the Pulidos are traitors, so my men will take them back to prison, and then I'll hang you." "We'll see," replied Zorro. "But I have something more to do before leaving, so you and Don Juan must sit over there." The governor and Don Juan sat by the window while Zorro told Ramon, "You offended Señorita Lolita and must pay for that. Your shoulder's better and you have a sword, so fight me." Ramon's eyes were wild. The governor knew all about his lies, and so he was no longer a captain. He looked at Zorro darkly. He would kill this outlaw. Then perhaps His Excellency would pardon him. He went over to the governor, saying, "Untie me, Excellency, and I'll kill him." "Do that, and you can be a captain again," said the governor, untying him at once. Then the fight began. Ramon ran at his enemy, sword in hand, but Zorro fought back cleverly, his gun in his left hand, his sword in his right. "Kill him, Ramon!" cried the governor. He and Don Juan knew that Zorro would shoot if they moved, so they sat still. Then Zorro threw his gun on the table. "I'll use my sword, Excellency, if either of you tries anything," he told the governor. But neither he nor Don Juan wanted to try. Now Zorro's left hand was free, and he pushed Ramon back. The captain fought more weakly than before. Suddenly, Ramon thrust his sword wildly at Zorro, who jumped back unhurt. At once, the outlaw's sword made 3 quick cuts on his enemy's face, leaving a red letter Z there. Then Zorro thrust his sword through Ramon's body, and the captain fell to the floor, dead. "Now I'll leave," said the outlaw. "I'll hang you for this," cried the governor. "If you catch me," laughed Zorro. He took his gun, ran outside, and jumped on his horse, ready to ride away. But it was now early morning. 3 groups of soldiers were arriving back from Pala, the Pulido's country house, and San Gabriel, and Zorro was in the middle of them. Suddenly, one of Gonzalez's men saw him, crying, "The curse of Capistrano!" Zorro galloped across the square. Just then, the governor and Don Juan ran into the street. "Stop him! Murderer!" they cried. He rode hard for the highway now, dividing the crowd of soldiers in his way. "After him!" shouted Sergeant Gonzalez angrily. Then Zorro turned a corner in the road. But what was this? Someone was galloping into town, and behind them, a group of soldiers followed. "Which way now? Back or straight on?" He turned around, but then, over his shoulder, he saw that the rider coming nearer was Señorita Lolita. "Wait!" she cried. Soon she was by his side, and together they rode into town. "I escaped from Fray Felipe's house," began Lolita. "Tell me later," cried Zorro. Suddenly there were soldiers with guns before them. "Take them, dead or alive!" screamed Gonzalez. "Quickly, do what I do!" called Zorro. He rode his horse fast at the men, jumping over them at the last minute. Lolita followed. "Where now?" she cried. "To the tavern." They jumped off their horses and sent everyone out of the tavern before they locked the door. In no time, the square was full of soldiers. The governor arrived and Sergeant Gonzalez. Even Don Alejandro was there with other gentlemen of the neighborhood. "Everybody's here," laughed Zorro, watching through a hole in the tavern door. "Your young followers, too?" asked Lolita. "No. For them it was only an exciting night adventure. Speaking out by day against the governor is harder. This is the end. I'm going to die." "We're going to die," said Lolita. "I can't live without you." Just then, a group of young gentlemen on horses arrived in the square and rode over to the governor. "Stop!" shouted one. "What's that?" cried the governor. "We speak for all the gentlemen's families here. It was wrong to send the Pulidos to prison. You must pardon them. Zorro, too, must have a pardon. His only crimes are fighting against false justice and helping the weak and the poor." "What do you say, Don Alejandro Vega? Must I pardon these traitors and this outlaw?" "You must," answered Don Alejandro. "I'm fully behind these gentlemen. Go back to San Francisco de Asis and leave South California to us. If you change your ways, we'll be loyal." "Very well," said the governor. "Then I pardon the Pulido family and Señor Zorro, too." Everybody cheered, and Zorro and Lolita left the tavern and walked into the square. "So who are you?" cried Sergeant Gonzalez. "Show your face." Zorro took off his mask, and everyone saw that he was Don Diego. Everybody was terribly surprised. Don Alejandro cried happily, "My son! But how?" "It began when I was 15, explained Don Diego. "I felt angry when the governor's men hurt the weak and poor in Capistrano, and I decided to fight back. I taught myself to use a sword and ride. I started wearing a mask and called myself Zorro. It wasn't easy being Don Diego by day and Zorro by night. But none of you learned my secret. Not even Señorita Lolita, who refused to love Don Diego for his money, but loved Señor Zorro for his true heart. Now I'll marry her if she wants me, and then the governor will think twice before he makes enemies of the Pulidos again. My days as Zorro are over, but from now on I'll be a more manly Don Diego. And for you, friend Gonzales, the news that you gave Don Diego of where you were riding was most helpful to Zorro. I'm sorry that you won't have your reward, but I'll pay for drinks at the tavern for you and your men." "What a gentleman!" cried Sergeant Gonzales.